It's time to die, kids and simpletons, and I know you're all not ready to go, but when it's your time, and you know what time it is today, because we are talking about death. After all this time, here we finally go. Now, let's just get this right out of the way. I love death. I'm pretty sure we all do, or you're at least interested in them. Why else would you be here? That being said, I love all their albums, I love all their songs, but for the longest time, all of us death metal and death fans, all we had for information were message boards and people in YouTube comments that had Chuck profile pictures that would just spew propaganda. And the unfortunate truth is that you're not going to get the exact, perfect representation of the history and how people really were when they died. And unfortunately, the main man of the band, Chuck Schuldiner, who would go on to be the vocalist and guitar player, principal songwriter of the band, the only guy to be on every album. He unfortunately died in the early 2000s, so for the longest time this has muddied the waters of the actual history and made everything murky, until recently, where there was a really good documentary put together called Death by Metal. So they finally put all that information out there, out in the open, everyone could see it, and all of the band members that have ever been involved, all the producers, everyone gave their own testimony of their times with Chuck, their times being in death and making these awesome albums. And a lot of you fans out there that have your Chuck profile pictures that act like you worship this band, a lot of you don't actually know the history and how things went down. And let me just make this clear cut. I love this band, okay? I would not be here making this super long video to demean Chuck or, basically kick dirt on the grave of a dead man. We are here in support and worship and to share the information of this band and their discography to get more people into them. So if you're gonna sit here and say, because I'm telling the truth of how things went down, and I'm not gonna gloss up how things went down, no matter the good or the bad, Chuck has had good and bad moments. So we're gonna talk about all of them, and if you don't like that and you're just gonna say, well, you all hate Chuck, if you're telling the truth, then you could just get the hell out. Chuck's last name has been pronounced so many times. I don't even think anyone could really figure it out because of Chuck's very strong Floridan accent. If his name is actually Chuck Schuldiner, Chuck Schuldiner, Chuck Schuldiner, Chuck whatever, okay? And I'm probably gonna pronounce it every way by accident because I've heard all the band members pronounce it that way, all the fans pronounce it that way. So I'll just refer to him as Chuck as much as I can so you guys know who I'm talking about. Now, he started a band originally called Mantis, and they were going for an extreme metal sound. Many say that they were death metal by this point, putting out demos under the name Mantis. But for sure, they are extreme metal, influenced by thrash and all the heavy stuff at the time, Merciful Fate, Venom, and would eventually become very influenced by the arguably first death metal band, Possessed. But we'll get to that in a bit here. Now, some of the members of this Mantis lineup were actually really interesting because Chuck didn't originally do vocals or the death growls of this era. It was actually originally the drummer and vocalist and infamous frontman of Massacre known as Cam Lee, who Chuck and him to the grave hated each other. Cam Lee would bring out blow-up dolls on stage and be like, "This is Chuck, isn't he gay?" and then beat him up and stuff. And then they also had a guitar player in this lineup that would later be in Death on the Leprosy album, which we'll get to in a little bit here. And that guitar player's name was Rick Ross. Now, they were putting out many demos, and even the early Death demos were pretty much bordering, if not being literally death metal, with the most infamous of all being Death by Metal, which inspired the name of that documentary, which is awesome, which you should check out for sure. Chuck eventually changed his name to an even more simple name known as Death, which was kind of inspired by his brother who had died several years before. And he said he wanted to make the name, even though a dark name of Death, into something kind of positive, like continuing on his brother's memory. Now, Chuck in these early days could not, for the life of him, figure out where he wanted to live. Him and his brand of death, just him, by the way, at this point, moved all the way to California. In a little bit, he'd keep ping-ponging between California and Florida. But as we get to, he'd eventually land in Florida. But at this time, Death was getting their start truly for their debut album out in California, where he met Chris Reifert to play the drums, who was really, really young at the time. And many of you death metal aficionados would know would go on to form the band Autopsy, which are the kings of death doom. Now just this lineup of the two of them were able to get signed to Combat Records, which was kind of this up and coming underground extreme metal label, was even having Megadeth and whatnot at the time. Sure, they were talking to Steve DiGiorgio at the time to play bass on the album, and he was from Sadus, and he's a really damn good bass player, probably the best in all of death metal. And even though he'd go on to do the tour at the time and tour with them, he still could be able to join the band. So Chuck ended up having to do vocals, guitar, and bass, where Chris was just doing the drums. Now, they were originally going to record in Florida, but then a bunch of problems happened and it sounded terrible out there, and the producer was whacked out of his mind. And then they came back to California again to do the album, their debut album, Scream Bloody Gore.
And we talked to a guy named Otto, and we were explaining our vision, and he just gave us the blank look, like, I have no idea what you're talking about, but I'll record your band. So anyways, we start recording, and I remember the first thing that was weird is, like, how you tone down drum heads by putting, pads or like tape on them or something. He stuck a fucking maxi pad on my floor tom. I'm like, I don't like this. So we got through, I think, 7 songs, and Combat had to listen, and they said no. So they just wrote off that first session as a mistake and booked time in Los Angeles with Randy Burns.
Now, this album was pretty damn scary for its time. I mean, sure, we had aggressive stuff, but nothing this dark, this murky. And just look at that album cover alone. The first 3 albums would have art from Ed Repka, who was infamous for doing tons of thrash metal, death metal, and his most notable work is probably the album covers for Megadeth. But these death album covers are just as good as the Megadeth ones. The best one's probably Leprosy, but the actual music still holds up for being really creepy. It's super aggressive, it's for sure death metal, and it has the absolute sickest screams of like all time. Now, what really makes this album shine beyond the actual good music, and what makes it like truly dark and without question death metal, is the Randy Burns production. When they went back to California, they had the album produced by Randy Burns, who was most notable for doing the production on Megadeth's Peace Sells But Who's Buying. Really damn dark, and oddly enough, although his last name is Burns and he's a producer, and their later infamous producer Scott Burns would work with them, neither of them have any relation to each other for some reason. So what's up with that? There's tons of awesome songs on here, and most of this material is stuff they've been working on for years, with a couple newer songs, a couple songs that they leave off, which I'll talk about in a bit, which still pisses me off. But some songs on here, God, they just still hold up, even though a lot of idiots will call this album immature. Even though they're immature, some of these riffs are the best of the genre, so shut up! And has their most fan favorite early 80s death metal song on there, Zombie Ritual. You gotta drink from the goblet, the goblet. I love the title track, Torn to Pieces is awesome. I keep going all day, Baptized in Blood, but my favorite song here has to be one of the most earliest songs they were working on, which is a song based on one of my favorite horror comedy franchises of all time, Evil Dead, with the song the same title. Why did they leave off Land of No Return and Beyond the Unholy Grave? Those 2 songs end up on some of the special editions, some different versions of the album, but it's not on the original versions of the album. Now, sure, they didn't have enough room for some releases to have 12 tracks, I get it. But let's be honest here for a second. Those 2 songs are way better than almost half of this album. And some of these songs, although good, like Regurgitated Guts, those songs are kind of half-assed compared to these awesome finished songs. So what were they thinking? But is this album the first death metal album? I don't know. And when you get into this argument, a lot of people will say, well, of course it's Death, because Death is the best ever, so how could it not be Death? And then a lot of people will counter the argument of Possessed putting out 7 Churches first with, Well, Death put a death demo of death metal out first, but then you can make the argument, well, hold on now. Possessed put out a death metal demo that maybe came out before that too. So, which is it? Well, then some people will say, well, Mantis put out... So, okay. Whoever started death metal is never going to be answered. Whoever the first death metal band is arguable because Possessed, although Seven Churches, I'll get into that in a bit, I definitely think it's death metal. The other stuff is kind of not death metal. So, who's the first death metal band? I don't know. Is it defined by who does death metal like all the time? Because then I guess it would be Death. But then you can make the argument, what about Necrophagia, who recorded an album but shelved it for years, but they recorded it before Scream Bloody Gore came out, and it was definitely death metal. So what about that? Who knows? But I can tell you this, in my opinion, and I could get into it later at some point, because I know this can keep starting arguments. Almost the entire comment section is going to be who started death metal. I just know it is. My opinion, Seven Churches was the first death metal album, okay? They're both very similar. Many argue that Seven Churches has thrash elements, but so does Scream Bloody Gore. They both have like equal amounts of thrash elements. They both have the death growls. They both have the crazy riffs that are much, much heavier and more erratic than thrash metal. But Seven Churches also has a lot of things that Scream Bloody Gore does not. There's more frantic, arguably blast beat drumming on the whole thing, as well as, although there's thrash songs, just deliberate thrash songs, a lot of those songs have crazy dissonant riffs, which are pretty much only known for really heavy death metal. Now, at the end of the day, if you want to say Death was the first death metal band, Scream Bloody Gore is the first death metal album, I'm not going to get that pissed. I'm really not. But to just sit there and not even listen to Seven Churches and act like, no, this is without question the beginning, you're just a complete idiot, okay? And you need to go back to school.
As far as people giving credit to Death as being the inventors of this form of music, I can't go that far and accept that type of comment.
So Chuck and Death were going to tour for this album with Sadis, who of course had Steve DiGiorgio at the time. But in typical Chuck fashion, he ended up going home before this tour saw conclusion and didn't even bring Chris Reifert with him. He offered, Chris, come back to Florida with me. But of course, Chris was just kind of like, well, I live in California. Why are you going to Florida? But this move ended up being really important because Chuck moving back to Florida and then being contacted by Rick Ross, who you remember from Massacre, asking if he wants to do something with him, and they both ended up being the next Death lineup, would end up causing Florida, and especially Tampa, to be the home of death metal. Funnily enough, though, death metal shows never did too well in Tampa, but it was where all the bands were living at for some reason. Now, Chuck decided to recruit some other members in the scene, and members that were working with Rick, and oddly enough, Cam Lee in a band called Massacre. He pulled Terry Butler, the bass player, and Bill Andrews, the drummer. And a lot of monumental changes, not just to death, but death metal came in at this time too. So they hooked up with Eric Greif, who would be their longtime manager and friend. And the big kicker here, they decided to go to Morrisound Studios to record the next album, which their main producer and main engineer, main mixer, their main man, Scott Burns, who was getting infamous at the time for doing low budget but like really awesome sounding death thrash metal, death metal, decided to pair up with the band. And although they went there to kind of work with some other people, it was pretty much Scott Burns who would become the infamous man of this project, the infamous man of Morrisound Studios, and would pretty much be the producer on Death's next coming album, Leprosy.
It was just super heavy, but also technical, but catchy. It was memorable. And I think that's what Chuck took from all of the bands that he admired, is a lot of these bands that he really looked up to and loved to listen to, they just wrote really good songs and really kind of catchy songs.
Leprosy will spread within your body still today. Mirrors becomes hideous, sight too much today.
This album is a landmark of death metal, considered to be the best album of all 80s death metal, original style death metal, and it has all the trademarks, super aggressive riffs, awesome dark sound, and the drum sound is explosive. A lot of people think that the drum sound terrible because the snare sounds like a bomb. Before its time, it really makes it sound super heavy. Now, oddly enough, Terry Butler, although he was in the lineup at the time, just could not play bass on the album. Chuck ended up having to do it, but he couldn't do it for some reason.
I basically had like an anxiety attack, panic attack in the studio. So I just asked Chuck, hey dude, to save time and money, can you do the bass, And at the time, there was no problem at all. Nothing was even said about it really. Chuck's like, yeah dude, I did the bass on Scream to Gore, I can, it's no problem.
Now what makes this album and even the next one odd is that they're a little more collaborative than Death albums usually are. Usually it's Chuck pretty much writing everything, but Rick Ross co-writes almost everything on the album. And the music, starting from this point onwards until Chuck died, even in his other projects, were very different song structures. You know, Scream Bloody Gore on pretty much every album of any band ever. It'll be your typical intro, verse, chorus, and in Metal's case, guitar solo, verse, chorus deal. But when it came to Death, it was intro, first riff, second riff, third riff, fourth riff, however much they wanted to stack it, chorus, lengthy middle section with guitar solos, and then repeat the whole thing. There is no repeating verses and choruses until the end of the song. So starting here, this to me is the beginning of Death as the songwriters. And boy, did they come out with some awesome songs that are also really catchy for their time. Sure, the screams are toned down a little bit and the music isn't as visceral, but they replace it with really catchy songs and choruses that pretty much have you singing along. How can you not put on Born Dead and not sing along even with the aggressive riffage or the super catchy Forgotten Past?
Images of the forgotten past. Your first life revealed at last. Now you find your surprise.
Picking a favorite on this album is really hard because we're going to be super honest with ourselves. A lot of the songs on here are really similar, so picking a favorite's going to be pretty dang hard. That being said, maybe it's Open Casket, but most of the time my favorite song on here has to be Left to Die. Not just for the sick scream on there, not just for the riffs that sound like they came from later Death albums, not just for the awesome solos, all of it, but my favorite part is that verse. Now the fan favorite and pretty much everyone's favorite, maybe even mine, but we had to highlight some other songs here. It can't just be the Pull the Plug show, is Pull the Plug. Obviously, to this day, that song along with Zombie Ritual were not just played until the band ended, but they were pretty much played on the Death to All tours. Those are classic songs, classic death metal. And Pull the Plug, I think, is even stronger and maybe even the best popular death metal song ever written. And it has a lot of the same characteristics as Left to Die, and the fact that some of these riffs, especially the fast ones, are very characteristic of later Death. But much like Left to Die, most Death moments, the best moments are the slow, crushing ones, especially that amazing chorus. So they toured for this album with this lineup. No problems yet until they decided to do what they thought was going to be a co-headlining tour with Dark Angel. Now, Dark Angel, who are an awesome thrash metal band, actually had a drummer by the name of Gene Hoglan, who would later join Death. But there was a big falling out between these two bands when they were told that they were going to have co-billing.
They mentioned to Death, to Chuck or somebody, that it's equal billing, meaning that in the ads, on the posters, on the gig flyers, you're gonna have Dark Angel and you're gonna have Death right next to it, equal billing. That does not mean co-headlining.
Clearly, Dark Angel was more well-known than Death and had an album out more than Death did. It was implied that Dark Angel really was the headliner. I just remember an incident over drum risers. And they wanted Bill to set up in front of the riser and Gene to set up on the riser, and everyone was rolling their eyes.
His demands were starting to get rather cockamamie when Chuck, probably for the 10th time, said, we're leaving the tour. This time our tour manager said, go ahead.
Then came a change in the lineup when Chuck fired Rick Ross.
Now, I don't know if he sensed that Chuck was going in a new direction.
I assumed that's why I was let go, because I know he was looking to broaden his horizons, and it was his thing.
This is the only lineup change that I pretty much agreed with, in the sense that Rick Ross is the only other guitar player to be in Death that's not only not as good as Chuck, there are a lot of death guitar players that were better than Chuck, and he's the only one that's not even as good. So, sorry, Rick, I like you, but you're not gonna cut it, buddy. So then Chuck and Eric Greif brought in Cynic's guitar player at the time, Paul Masvidal, who would later join Death, but they kept trying to, at the time, get him, okay, don't just join for the tour, join for the album, join for the band, everything, and he just would not commit to anything. Nothing. So Terry Butler went and got his friend to join the band as the lead guitar player for the next album and tour. The awesome, and in my opinion, the greatest death metal lead guitarist of all time. And I know Chuck is awesome, don't worry. Don't worry, I love him too, but if you guys are a fan of death metal, James Murphy is the man, the god of lead guitar solos, because his solos are always so memorable and melodic, and to me, he was the true X factor of what made this next album so special.
I feel that Death is a band that I can put my personal outlook on certain things in life into, and I think it means a lot more when you're singing about something other people can relate to. Because right now I don't see any demons flying around, and I don't see Satan. Yeah, pigeons. But I don't see Satan coming out, and I don't see hell bubbling underneath me. I see reality.
Escaping reality that surrounds you. Using faith and excuse.
Now, despite this album being a big, mature leap musically and even lyrically, where the horror themes, starting even on Leprosy, we're starting to slowly get more and more real. And on this album, it's almost more thrash lyrics with how much it's talking about society as a whole. But for some reason, a lot of idiots and modern metal aficionados and critics, or I hate to call them publicists and reporters, would love to say that Spiritual Healing, it's the worst Death album. It's good, but it didn't really change the game. It just sounds like Leprosy. And the other Death albums are so much better. And I clearly never listened to this album, because if you think Spiritual Healing did not move the goal of this band towards technicality, you are a retard, because Spiritual Healing is just as technical musically as Human. Go back and actually listen to this album. There are so many odd time signatures, technical riffage, crazy lead guitar moments that characterize every later Death album and almost every technical death metal album at the time. Now, sure, I would not go as far to say Spiritual Healing is a technical death metal album, but I wouldn't even go as far to say that Human is. But if you really compare these two albums and say, wow, which one, is more technical than the other, they're both pretty much the same. The only difference with Human is it sure has some jazzy elements. But why are we not giving credit to Spiritual Healing as being the precursor and the beginning of Death's technical sound? So, you know what? My opinion's my opinion. But my opinion thinks that Spiritual Healing is one of the best, if not the best, Death album, and maybe even death metal album, okay? I love this album. I've always loved this album. I've never understood why everyone holds it in such low regard. You'll have idiots like Cover Killer Nation saying some vocals are off a little bit, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. So this begins the era of Death being technical. Now, they weren't the first to make this shift. In fact, there was a band known as Atheist, who are also awesome, who actually went straight up, full on, no compromise technical death metal with out and out jazz elements, which are undeniable. And guess what? They were before Death. So Death did not start technical death metal. Sorry, kids. Now, the elements, though, are definitely present. There's tons of melodic elements as well, especially James Murphy's guitar leads, guitar solos, and the moment in Low Life, which is a song about Hitler, where Chuck and James just go off and have a guitar battle and like a lead section together, is the best moment on the entire album. Now, speaking of melodic, The song that James Murphy co-writes, in fact, this is probably the most collaborative album where James and Terry, all of them are like writing every song together. The song Within the Mind, which has obvious co-writes from James Murphy with how melodic and catchy it is, should have been a music video, but you know, I guess everyone had their thumb up their asses when it came to that. You have really technical, awesome songs that are still catchy, like Defensive Personalities. You have just straight to the point killer songs like Killing Spree. And the song that to me is like a mishmash of both, and which summarize the entire album, is the opening track, Living Monstrosity. And once again, the best moment of this song is definitely the slow breakdown in the middle, where of course Chuck infamously says, "She's a stupid bitch."
Some say she's naive. She's a stupid bitch. Some say to forgive.
Now, all of a sudden, after Living Monstrosity and the second track in the album, Altering the Futures, where things get really crazy, where all of a sudden we're like, what is going on with this band? Technical elements all over the place, odd time signatures, a song that's actually about abortion, you know, the giving and taking of life, is awesome. Awesome song that is really showing off the change in the band, and it's by far the weirdest song on the album.
Maybe I just, but maybe not. Or to be thrown in the trash to rot.
Picking a favorite song's really hard. I mean, we've already highlighted enough songs as is. God, it's every song of the album on different days. Living Monstrosity, Altering the Future, Low Life is a lot of the time. Maybe it's the title track, and a lot of people think the title track is quite possibly the best song they've ever written. It's one of their only lengthy epic songs, and all the riffs on it are amazing. All the lead parts are really good. The best part of the songs were in the middle. It gets super slow, super heavy, with a riff that was inspired by an older song called Legion of Doom.
Practice what you preach. To avoid is now deceased. Knowledge is at our hand.
That is maybe the best death breakdown of all time, okay? You are an idiot if you think that this album is any weaker or doesn't change the sound at all. It's a huge leap above Leprosy. Sure, the production still sounds like it's in the 80s, okay? Sure. But the music is what ultimately matters, and the music is the beginning of the technical sound. If you can't even go back and check to see if these facts I'm dropping on you are true, which they are, and you're just gonna sit here and say that this album is a write-off, it's them mailing it in, it's no change here, then just, you're a fucking idiot. But after this album, they went on tour again, and everything fell apart again. James kept fighting with Chuck, and so he was out, which was a terrible move on Chuck's part, because James is awesome.
James and Chuck started clashing a bit. I think it was just egos a little bit, you know. James is a good friend of mine, but he was a bit quirky, you know, and at times it might rub people raw. I mean, it had been building up between him and Chuck for the whole tour, you know, and Chuck just snapped, said, "That's it, you're out of the band."
And then things got really bad when they were supposed to go tour in Europe. However, Chuck really didn't want to do it, and he pretty much no-showed at the last minute.
He really dreaded getting on that plane and going to Europe. At that point in time, we were in a litigation with each other.
We had signed contracts and we had all this stuff laid out already. Merch was already made. Techs were already hired from Creator. You know, there's a lot on the line. So I called the booking agent. The booking agent called Chuck's mom. She was Chuck's power of attorney. And basically what we worked out stated that, you know, Chuck wasn't going to Europe for the tour.
And so they left, and they got Louie and they got Walter. And then I got a call from my lawyer. You're never going to guess who just called me.
About 3 or 4 weeks into the tour, Chuck called the booking agent in TCI that was in New York, represented us, and told him, you know, his head was a little more clear now, and he felt like he could go on tour. He wanted to be part of the tour. And Mitch Carduna from TCI told him, "Dude, you cannot go. They'll," yeah. And he couldn't understand that. "That's my band." He's like, "Well, contractually, through the label, they're 2/3 of the band over there right now, you know? I mean, that's just the way it is. And, you know, Creator don't want you over there, you know, just because of what happened."
So Chuck at this time tried to claim that they tried to steal the name of Death from him, and they went on tour without me. Ooh. Even though to this day they all say no, we were just filling the contractual obligations of touring the European tour with Creator. So, in my opinion, Chuck was definitely in the wrong. They all could have gotten sued out the ass. Not just Chuck, which funnily enough, all these members went and did Chuck's job for him to promote Death and to tour for this album, and Chuck wasn't there. And if he wasn't there at the start just because he was afraid to go to Europe, then that's Chuck's problem, not the other guys, for doing his job. I'm sorry, but this was definitely Chuck being an asshole. I don't want to have to say that because I love Chuck, but, you know, a lot of people think just because Chuck wore cat shirts that he was the nicest dude on the planet and that he had a soft-spoken voice. But there's a reason why a lot of people, especially within the band Death, could never get along with Chuck, and it's for stuff like this. It got Death a terrible reputation for the fact that Chuck wasn't able to go on the road, and could you imagine how worse it would have been if they didn't tour and Chuck and everyone pulled out? So at least they kind of saved Chuck's ass there, which he never gave him credit for. And then Chuck was just infamous for fighting with promoters, fighting with band members, even fans sometimes. A lot of people shove that under the rug, and cool if Chuck was cool with you when you met him. But the other band members tell a different story of when they worked with him, and that's just the truth. Once again, if you don't like that, if you can't accept it, then move on and go listen to some propaganda. So Chuck fired them all, blamed them all for his problems.
Well, over the last year, I've had some problems that I've had to overcome. I like to look at them as obstacles, and I feel it's good to learn from your mistakes, perhaps, if you want to call them that, or problems. I felt I was going against a lot of odds due to the fact that there was very negative press and a lot of people literally trying to drag my name as a person and as a band through the mud.
And then he decided to hire an extremely technical lineup of musicians to not just aid to the technical music that he was writing at the time, but to also add some jazzy flares, which are very characteristic of technical death metal. So he brought in Steve DiGiorgio, finally, from Sadus into the lineup, who does an awesome job, as always. And he brought in the two members of Cynic, Sean Reinert, and Paul Masvidal, who finally joined the band. Paul Masvidal on guitar, and Sean Reinert, who's an awesome drummer, on the drums. Now, those two, because of their work in Cynic, are super jazzy instrumentalists, awesome songwriters, everything. But musically, they were kept slightly on a leash because Human, the album that they go on to do, is not that much more technical and spiritual healing. Now, funnily enough, though, both these members from Cynic came out as gay a couple years back, and then unfortunately Sean Reinhart has died in recent times. But they came out as gay, and a lot of people use that as ammo because everyone made fun of Chuck for the way he talked and the way he was in the early days of being gay. So everyone's like, oh my gosh, this is another reason that's 100% proof that Chuck was gay and he died of AIDS or some shit. Whatever. But this lineup, which is like a super group, as well as the next lineup, which would also pretty much be an extreme metal super group, would be pretty much the two best, by far, and pretty much equally good lineups that Death ever had. Now, instead of being on Combat, they made another change to sign on to Relapse, which is also Relativity, and Relapse Records pretty much will not stop re-releasing Death albums with like remasters and special editions to this day. But this label, this lineup would go on to make arguably the most important death metal album of the 90s, to push the boundaries further, to piss off and create an entire movement against this album, which ended up being black metal. We're of course talking about the band's highest selling album of all time, Human.
He had worked on some of the Human songs with Terry ahead of the split. So some of the material was already written and recorded, like demos of these songs. So to give these songs to these jazzy cats from Miami was incredible because it came together in a way that was totally fresh.
Right off the bat, even the drum intro and flattening of emotions, you could hear that there is a lot more musicality to at least the way that they put flares over the music. Sure, it was simple sometimes, and a lot of this album focuses on heavy riffs. When they go off in their jazz elements, most notably, Paul Masvidal and Sean Reinhart, they really go off. And the whole band goes into their technical best aspects, and the instrumental song on the album, Cosmic Sea. But I could agree that this album in many ways is a push closer to what would become technical death metal. And the fact that there's so many jazzy flares and your typical odd time signature riffs within technical death metal. But its biggest strengths are the fact that it commingles those moments with more often mixing in just the catchy, straightforward, crushing, catchy death metal riffs and choruses. And you have awesome songs of the album that follow that flow, like Flattening of Emotions, Together as One, Secret Face, and the song that probably commingles those elements the best, Suicide Machine.
Suicide Machine.
And I love that part in Suicide Machine real quick where you have Chuck's voice all phased and overlap. He's like, and starting with this album kind of going forward, there'd be a lyrical and even song title change. All the songs were very elusive and progressive and pretentious. Weird song titles to say the least. A lot of people were like, that's gay, but not like the Judas Priest gay where they're literally songs about sucking dick. People are like, these songs are gay and stupid, and Chuck thinks he's so self-absorbed, talking about flattening of emotions and some lack of comprehension. We want some goblet of gore! But none of that matters because the music is awesome. That's really all we care about. Now, they actually had their very first music video for this album, even though their first one should have been on the last album with Within the Mind, with the arguably best song on the whole album, a fan favorite song, Lack of Comprehension. Music video's awesome, and even though Death didn't exactly have the best stage presence, this music video made them look like giants. Now, Scott Burns is only credited with mixing the last two albums. There was other people that, kind of produced them, like Eric Greif or Dan Johnson. But when it comes to this album, Scott takes full reign and does everything. In my opinion, he is the most important member on the entire album. He is what truly defines Human and what I think makes Human a staple of death metal, technical death metal. Everything is his production and mixing and mastering everything. Everything he does in the album gives it not only a good, clear sound, but also extremely heavy sound, where maybe even the music isn't as heavy as it once was. It sure as hell sounds heavier and darker. And the Scott Burns production, most notably shown on this album and other albums he was working on at the time, truly did define the genre of not just death metal, but thrash, everything he was working on. That real drudgy, heavy sound really works the best with this type of music. And a lot of people that are my age and now had this dumb mentality of thinking Scott Burns was the death of the genre or something, and that, ooh, modern clear production works the best with death metal. But I'm sorry, this was the best death metal production ever. It's the best sound it could possibly have, and all this modern sound, all this modern production, to me, ruins what would have been otherwise awesome music. And production with extreme metal is the most important element of all, and it is absolute A+ on this album, and what I think is maybe the main reason why Human is one of all of our favorite death albums, but one of my favorite as well. Oddly enough though, at this time, even though Death were at the cutting edge of death metal itself, Chuck was starting to get kind of annoyed with everything about the band. Ooh, our lyrics in the past, the band name, the logo, which they kept constantly changing until they removed every horror element from the logo except the death scythe. And then eventually would turn into, ooh, we don't consider ourselves death metal, or we hate death metal, whatever. It would eventually just begin to make Chuck more and more jaded over time. In fact, they even, on this album, stopped using Ed Repka covers and started using stuff that was a little more pretentious, but if I'm gonna be honest, that stuff looks pretty creepy too. Now, they decided to tour for this album. Everyone thought they weren't gonna actually go through with it, and they were doing all right at the beginning. They got Scott Kareem to play bass, and he actually did some bass work on Cosmic Sea and ended up finishing the song, because that was like the last song of the sessions, and everything was going well, until everything fell apart again.
By then, Chuck was growing really homesick. It had been 2 weeks out, and he really wanted to go home. And Reinert collapses. He gets very, very sick, has to be brought to the hospital. Then I, being a diabetic and not paying attention to my health, I got sick.
And then Eric had to go to a hospital, and then that's when it fell apart.
So I stayed, and the idea was I would keep in touch by phone from the venues. Something happened when Chuck got to Germany where he flipped his lid about the promoter and something relating to the gigs. And by then, of course, he was at wit's end because he did not want to be out. And the next thing I know, I'm fired for not being by his side, and he's quit. And because the bus was put up, the money for that was put up by the British promoter who hadn't had his shows yet, they were at the end of the tour, he flipped out because he lost all this money. So he put a lien on the gear.
Our gear got taken. So my drums, Paul's guitar amps, and Mike Prees and all that shit were held hostage. And we were now signed and supposed to, write and record a record. And it took us like 9 months to get our gear back.
And he gathered the guys together, and somehow they made it back to London for the flights back home. Because, of course, the flights were from London 2 months later.
It was Chuck saying Eric, and Eric saying Chuck, and the bus company saying the entity death. And then that's where everybody, it kind of turned into Lord of the Flies.
Sean and Paul claimed that Chuck didn't call them back for some reason, but Chuck claims they all left to go back to Cynic, so who knows what really happened there. But essentially, Chuck broke off from everyone, including his manager, Eric, this time. So he had to restart all over again. But he did bring in one good friend to return. That would be Steve DiGiorgio to play bass again on the next album. And he decided to get another friend to come in and play drums. He brought in the awesome Atomic Clock, one of my favorite drummers of all time, Gene the Man Hoglan, who this amazing commingling rhythm section, which actually the bass was kind of buried on Human, so you couldn't get the full rhythm section. On this album, Individual Thought Patterns, the rhythm section destroys, making Death's true, full delivery of technical death metal.
Death will always remain a growing band because I think there's definitely too much of a limit being put on death metal right now. And I want to keep continuing to grow as a musician and as a person in life, and to try to put into the music what I learned, so to speak.
Now this album is technical death metal through and through. They jam as many riffs as humanly possible to the point of insanity of like 3 minutes and like 20 fucking riffs. And you still have the jazz elements, melodic sections, solos, and way more odd time signatures than before, to the point where a lot of people actually really do not like this album. And if you're perturbed by progressive elements like that and just weird sounding songs, you are going to not like this album. Now, although Ralph Santola, the 6-string rock-a-rolla, would do the tour for this album, they actually brought in the man, Andy LaRocque from King Diamond, who has the most haunting guitar solos of all time. Now, you'd think that'd be kind of a weird pairing, this guy that's pretty much doing traditional metal. But at the time, King Diamond was kind of taking some time off from his solo band, was reuniting with Merciful Fate, so Andy had nothing to do. And he was going to do some new stuff, and Chuck sent an invite out to him, and boy, you wouldn't have thought it, but his guitar solos are maybe the most perfect guitar solos for all of Death. And as much as I love Chuck, he destroys Chuck on this album. Now, because of that, we have another all-star lineup here, and in my personal opinion, maybe even the best lineup they've ever had, maybe even slightly better than Human. And they just go completely off on every track. There's no subtlety to be found here other than the instrumental opening of Destiny with acoustic guitars. The rest of this is just brutal to the bone with just technical riffage. You got Overactive Imagination, one of their best, most technical ripping, one of my all-time favorites. And just what a hell of a way to open the album. You also have Jealousy, which is crazy Destiny with this awesome acoustic intro going into killer riffage and melody. And you have my favorite song on the album, the awesome, underrated Inhuman Form. Now this album gets completely nuts with Philosopher, the ending track. Steve's doing some basically fretless bass solo work at the end of the song. But this was an iconic song. Not only did it have a music video, but it was also made fun of by Beavis and Butthead.
Ooh. Is this a joke? Yeah. Yeah. I think this is supposed to be funny. Hey, check it out. It's Jeremy. Yeah. He's still running.
One of the best songs on the album by far, this, Overactive Imagination, Inhuman Form, and Trapped in a Corner are probably the best, but geez, it's really hard. The whole album is like equally good. It is one of the best. But what makes Philosopher kind of funny and stand out, though, is a lot of people say because Chuck says in the song, you don't know your own sexuality, then everyone's like, oh, look, it's another thing that's proving Chuck is actually gay. But many theorize that the song is actually about one of the two members from Cynic, either Paul Masvidal or Sean Reinhart. But everything was working this time. Not only was the album doing well, it was one of their most highest selling. They were working together as a band. There was no problems. They did the tours, no issues. We're on Headbangers Ball, had a music video. Gene and Steve were holding the lineup together, making sure Chuck, didn't just lose it on people.
We hear the stories of the previous cycles, and I think me and Gene had kind of committed to each other to kind of, preempt that as much as we could. When he would get that tense, kind of, irritated, like almost ready to do something, whatever that may be, me and Gene would step in with a calm voice and just assure him we're there, we want to finish, we want to trudge on. And I think sometimes it pulled Chuck back in because we were able to finish all the dates and everything. He was wound a little tighter than most people. So I think sometimes when those stress issues came up, it really, he was right on his last coil and it just got to him.
Guess what? They had momentum finally building up, because every time you just throw out the lineup like that, you lose momentum. Every time you get drama going, you lose momentum. And they were finally gaining a lot of momentum. People were liking this Inhuman a lot. In fact, these two albums are pretty much the pinnacle of Death's popular critical acclaim. However, a lot of people kind of think that Death was at the time and is now the most popular death metal band, but at the time, even at their peak, they weren't even the most popular. Sure, they might be nowadays, but it was Morbid Angel at the time. They had way more music videos, sold way more albums. So Ralph Santola would not join the lineup full time. They finally got a hold of a friend that they wanted to get in the past, Bobby Cobley, to come in on the guitar front. And Steve had to leave, unfortunately, would never come back until they eventually did Control Denied due to family obligations, so they got in Kelly Conlon on bass. They signed with Roadrunner Records, and they went back into Morrisound, this time to actually work with Jim Morris, the main man, to do the production. And because of that, this next coming album would definitely be their most highly produced of all albums, the best sounding. So what was to come would be an album that would definitely stray away from the technical aspects, strip everything down to be more simple, but would have a huge melodic underpinning.
Chuck's riffs were starting to really explore his love of 80s power metal. It's like he went back 10 years and really started, letting his metal flow.
And he wanted to really inject more of a melodic content into death metal, which is somewhat of a dichotomy there, right? But he really wanted to do it. So if you listen to Symbolic and listen for the guitar parts, there's a giant leap forward to my ear in the melody content of the guitar parts.
Do you remember when things seemed so eternal?
So with Symbolic, with its higher vocals, more melodic riffs and guitar solos and lead sections, more punchy, to-the-point riffs, is, in essence, melodic death metal.
Empty words, no escaping from those haunting empty words.
And like switching to melodic death metal at the time would be considered selling out, a lot of people, and a lot of people forget this, but a lot of people did not like this album. Now, I don't want to get into an argument with any idiot that's like, well, I liked this album at the time. I'm not talking about you. all the members of the band will even vouch that all the fans were bitching to them about how much they did not like this material. People on the road were not getting into the songs that they were playing from it. And Chuck, of course, didn't care, but they just could not get into it.
People did not feel about Symbolic the way that they kind of do now. You know, it was like, people were like, what the hell are you guys doing? And Chuck just didn't care. Chuck's like, dude, I'm writing my music. I'm doing my thing. You go listen to your death metal.
It's kind of weird to think that what if they didn't have Gene Hoglan on this album, because a lot of the heaviness of this album doesn't even derive from the riffs or even the vocals. It's the fact that Gene Hoglan plays so over the top that there's no way you could consider this album anything other than aggressive and heavy. But despite this pretty much being melodic death metal and all the characteristics of melodic death metal, for some reason, a lot of idiots that were not there at the time, and well, I wasn't really there at the time, but I'm no idiot, or am I? But a lot of people try to say, well, actually, Symbolic is actually the beginning of death being progressive death metal, which is stupid because not only is this album pretty much not technical at all, especially compared to the other albums, and it's not really even progressive either. The only song where those elements even show up is the last song, which I must admit is in such heavy abundance with the progressive and melodic and technical elements that, yeah, I'll pretty much call it a progressive death metal song, is Perennial Quest. A great song, and I must say, even though Chuck's not my favorite guitar player in Death, from this point onwards, he's definitely the best of these lineups to come, and he rips it on the solo section of the song where things get real technical. But there's a reason a lot of people view this as the best Death album nowadays, even if they weren't into it at the time, and that's because the songs on here are so awesome. It's so easy to get into. The production's so good. At the end of the day, the riffs are just badass, like Symbolic, Thousand Eyes. I could go on and on and on. Without Judgment might be my favorite, but everyone's personal favorite. They must admit at the end of the day, the big fan favorite, the song that people finally caught on to years later and now say is the best song they ever wrote, is the super melodic, catchy as hell, Crystal Mountain.
Crystal Mountain, evil takes its form.
But even I must say that the people at the time really didn't know what the hell they were talking about. This is a great album, and I really do understand why people nowadays hold it in such high regard. I would even say maybe start with this album if you're interested in getting into the band. I would at the very least say definitely start with one of these 90s albums from Death. This is my favorite era of the band, and you know what? Considering that this is the most easy one to get into, start here. Such a good production, once again, but funnily enough, even the remaster of this album sounds exactly the same as the original, and all the remasters kind of sound the same with minor changes, but this one just sounds completely identical. But I must quickly say that the remasters on Human, I think, kind of sound heavier because they had to remix the whole damn thing. But the remaster on Individual Thought Patterns, and this is a word of advice and warning to all the new Death fans, do not obtain the remaster of Individual Thought Patterns, because that album's re-release production is a literal ear rape. To make matters worse though, the fans not really getting this album at the time, is that Chuck was really starting to get sick of the band name, the fact that he had to do vocals and aggressive vocals. He really wanted to do something different, and he didn't like the scene. He wanted to do something more progressive. I mean, just on and on and on. He just really was jaded by this band, the entire scene.
We got the latest, whatever huge magazine in Europe it was. The back cover was a Symbolic ad, and it had 4 other albums from 4 different death metal bands. And this is when Chuck was really trying to get away from that tag, you know, just flat out. It's what he was trying to do. He didn't want to be called death metal. And he called the record label screaming, raging at him. I told you not to do this. I told you not to do this. Fuck you. I would rather break up my band than work for you anymore.
Sure, Chuck didn't love death metal at the time, but to scream at the label and say, I will leave you because of, you know, we're better than those bands, is probably the bitchiest, most self-centered thing you could do. And ever since that point, stuff started to fall apart. The end of the tour was miserable for everyone involved, And it came to a head when they were playing with Benediction.
We had a night off from the tour, but Benediction had a gig that night, and it was somewhere in Germany. So anyway, Benediction was like, oh, you got to come up and play a song. You got to come up and play a song. It's like, all right, well, whatever, we'll see what happens. Anyway, Chuck stayed on the bus. Brian, bass player Brian, Gene, and I ended up going inside and checking out the Benediction gig, and there were like 5 people in there in the audience. There was nobody there. And all of a sudden, Benediction is like, we're going to have some musicians in Death come up and play a song. So me and Brian are just kind of looking at each other like, okay, what's going to happen? And Gene started getting up on stage, so it's like, okay, I guess we're on. What are we going to do? It's like, okay, Chuck's nowhere to be found. I'm like, let's play Zombie Ritual. Well, Chuck found out about it, and he wasn't very happy about it. The next day, he kind of sat us all down. He's like, you know what, that was really not cool and disrespectful. And basically, you shouldn't have done that. Very strongly worded, I'm like, Chuck, we really didn't mean anything by it. It really wasn't that big of a deal. There was no one in the club. And he's like, you know what, man? He's like, you're conjuring a dick.
The last 10 days were just, they weren't fun. They were a real challenge to get through. We got through it. And that's the thing, when Chuck broke up the band, when he said, this is it, we're done after this, I was like, now I don't have to quit.
And a lot of people say, Chuck, if he was still alive, he would have been doing death metal. But I'm sorry, all signs point to him just continuing to do Control Denied, more progressive metal stuff, because he just really hated the entire scene and sound and even the band. And it's a miracle he even did another album after this. I'm trying to go easy on Chuck because I know he's dead. I know it's hard to say bad things or him doing bad things, especially, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter as much anymore because he's gone now. It's over. The band's over. It's all in the past. But, trying to be objective here and talk about the history is hard because, here we go. Fucking again, the band lineup, everything falls apart again. And I'm sorry, but it's Chuck's fault. If you have Gene Hoglan, of all people, the nicest dude on the planet, that would literally join my band, and I don't have one, was telling you that he was being an asshole and he didn't want to be in the band anymore, then it's time to wake up and realize that Chuck was not exactly in the right headspace at the time, because Gene Hoglan is a beautiful, big, well-hung man. From all accounts, this was supposed to be the end of Death. Everyone bailed after the tour ended. And Chuck was trying to start up his new project, his progressive metal project called Control Denied. And he was trying to get signed, but of course the bad reputation Chuck brought along made it pretty hard. And all anyone wanted anyways was death because they knew that'd be safe.
The labels didn't want to gamble with Control Denied. They didn't want to gamble with him changing the name and changing the plan because death was an established thing, and they wanted to invest in something that they knew was more solid and they had a better idea of what it was going to do.
So after trying to sign with anything, they signed a Nuclear Blast, and they did make a deal that, okay, we will let you do Control Denied, no problem, but you have to make one more Death album. So Chuck was probably sitting there going, oh, fine. So Chuck hastily put something together with a lot of songs he had at the time, as well as pretty much got his entire lineup that he was going to use for Control Denied to go in the studio, go into Morris Sound, work with Jim Morris one last time to put out the final Death album. And the lineup was Scott Clendon on bass and Shannon Hamill on guitar and the awesome Richard Christie on drums. Now, a lot of you guys that are Howard Stern fans will know Richard Christie as the crazy dudes that do prank calls and stuff on Howard Stern. He really threw down the drums. Even though no one knew him at the time, he gave one of the best drum performances I've ever heard on this upcoming album, and boy did he slay. And he slays on everything he does. To my opinion, he is the best drummer Iced Earth even ever had. But essentially, Control Denied grouped together with Chuck to put out the final Death album, and it is by far the most interesting one musically.
People were getting boxed in. It became like really a stiff genre, which is exactly backwards from the way it got invented. The original death metal stuff was, let's be outrageous, do new stuff, be totally different. And then a few years later, be totally different as long as it's exactly this, and just one little thing. Don't go outside of that. Well, you don't say that to Chuck Schuldin.
Now, this is where I started with the band. and the album I got into them with. And what I have to say is do not start here. I'm not saying that is a bad thing of like, this is a terrible album, I was an idiot for liking it at the time. No. I'm just saying that it, although is kind of easier to get into, it makes it harder for you to get into the death metal sound because most of this album is not really death metal in a lot of its ways, and a lot of its music, a lot of its, delivery. So it's gonna make all these like hardcore death metal, technical death metal albums like really impossible to get into. That 90s stuff, the other 4 albums in the past, sure, that's a good place to start. But here, not really. Now let's talk about the bad first, the stuff that I just do not like about the album, and what a lot of people do not like about this album. Now at this time, Chuck had an anti-death metal mentality, so a lot of it's kind of anti-death metal. The production isn't really heavy and drudgy, it's more high pitch, especially the guitar sound. It's just really uncharacteristically death metal. The drums are extremely progressive rock orientated, so no death metal drums in that department. And the vocals are extremely high pitch, which is really not characteristic of death metal at all. That being said, you could say easily that because the riffs are pretty heavy still, and that the vocals are still aggressive, and that it's musically progressive, that it's progressive death metal. So you wouldn't be wrong there, but it's definitely musically, in the mindset of Chuck at the time, almost an anti-death metal record. Now it's also without question a cobbled together death album because sure, the music is really good and they definitely put time into working on the songs. They put time into working on the songs because they're supposed to be controlled, denied songs.
Fight the Pain, Spirit Crusher, A Story to Tell, Voice of the Soul, and A Moment of Clarity. All 5 were originally control denied songs.
If you still don't believe the band members that this was control denied, even though Chuck denies it, you want to be on Chuck's side there, fine. But listen to the demos for Sound of Perseverance, where Chuck actually sings in them and tell him that this does not sound like it was supposed to be control denied.
We had recorded those as demo versions, and then Chuck had put some clean vocals on a couple of those, and we were auditioning different singers with those.
And to make matters even funnier is that Chuck said he wanted Whirl Dane from Nevermore and Sanctuary to be the vocalist of Control Denied, so it's kind of funny that Chuck's clean vocals ended up sounding a lot like Whirl Dane on these demos. So you got 5 Control Denied songs, you have a cover song on here that everyone goes crazy about, and then you have a song on here that pretty much has a riff that is like a sped up version of Symbolic, and you have like a cobbled together album. This would have been the best as a Control Denied album because musically more focused on being progressive metal. But let's go into the good here. Despite all this, I think it's an excellent album for what it is. A progressive metal or progressive death metal album. It really is truly a great album to the point that I love every song in here that Death Row, or was supposed to be Control Denied. This time it is actually progressive metal because they keep changing the riffs with having elements to the last riff, and that's like pretty much a characteristic of progressive rock and metal, and they have tons of riffs all over the songs, and even technical elements. Odd time signatures are abundant here as well, and I think all of that is coalesced and perfectly put together on the album's epic song, Flesh and the Power It Holds. Scavenger of Human Sorrow is like one of the best songs in the album. The drumming, I mean, Richard Christie's drumming's really good, but his fills sound like a loot train falling off a mountain with how much crazy cymbal work he throws all over the damn place. And it's especially nuts because the drum beat on Scavenger of Human Sorrow isn't even a drum beat, it's just a constant fill the whole time. My favorite song here has to be the absolute fan favorite and really melodic and catchy, as well as crushingly killer when it goes into the fast moment, Spirit Crusher. This album may be my least favorite, but it's a great album. I just rather would have had it been a Control Denied album because I'm a big Control Denied fan, and it's unquestionable that this was supposed to be Control Denied. And it just kind of sounds wrong in this context. There's a reason Chuck didn't want to put harsh vocals over the music he was doing anymore. And after the tour where the lineup was absolutely killer, they had the infamous show at Eindhoven, And they even had like a pro shot show in LA. There's awesome, awesome performances. Chuck was finally let free to go roam in the fields and make his Control Denied band, which was pretty much the same lineup except they brought in Steve DiGiorgio to play bass, which Steve DiGiorgio should have played on Symbolic and the Sound of Perseverance. And they released an awesome album called The Fragile Art of Existence, which had Tim Amer on vocals and sounds very similar to what the Sound of Perseverance demo sounded like. And it's once again obvious the Sound of Perseverance should have been a Control Denied album, because listen to how heavy Control Denied, a progressive metal band, was and how similar this sounds to the last album. But unfortunately, even though Chuck was really happy, finally musically engaged, and having really good relationships with people in his lineup and all around, making amends with people, everything was going good. Chuck was at the highlight of his life.
He said he was going to a chiropractor to fix the pain in his neck. It wasn't doing anything.
I can't remember what they did for him. They probably made some adjustments, which did nothing, obviously. Then he went to an acupuncturist, and from what I understand, she put one needle in the back of his neck and went like this and said, go get an MRI.
Despite Chuck having brain cancer and going through tons of treatments for it, there was a lot of problems that were just building up. His treatments were really making him weak, that he was susceptible to anything at that point, and the bills were piling up, and Chuck wasn't exactly a millionaire. So no matter what, he was feeling buried at the time, but he was through this whole period trying as hard as he could to finish this next Control Denied album. He was jumping around, sending demos to and from his band members.
And he actually did start getting better after that. And that's when we started working on this follow, the second record.
So much time had gone by from the recording of it, the patching of the bass tracks, and all that, that he was busy writing. And he was ready for the next album right away. Because I had recorded bass in the middle of '99, and by the next year, he had all kinds of new stuff. And he was working on it extensively with Richard Christie.
And to this day, people at More Sound are still trying to remix the demos that were being sent from Chuck to his band members to try to release the second Control Denied album, as well as they had some legal disputes with some Dutch label that had the rights to it. So it's been a nightmare trying to get that album released.
All of a sudden, it hit him again. So with this album, When Man and Machine Collide, he had taken home those, for that reason, he had taken home Richard's drum tracks and put them on a little, 8-track digital hard disk recorder. Of course, that's what led to, us having to extract all this stuff from that machine and all the other issues we've run into since.
There's a possibility of finishing an album. The amount of work that have to go into it is tremendous.
So not only would this album to this day, and hopefully it will eventually see the light of day, has not been released, Chuck was never able to hear the whole thing in its completion either, and he passed away shortly after.
There was a drug, and it was still at an experimental stage, and they really didn't know about dosing at the time. They agreed to take the risk as a last-ditch effort to save his life. And I think that when they knew that it was over, I think they decided to take him home. And they took him back to Citrus, and he passed away within an hour.
Chuck really was turning things around, and he was really musically inspired and happy person. Unfortunately, his health problems. But, I just want to say, though, it does kind of piss me off that all these people that hated Chuck until the bitter end, until he died, came out at the time and to this day acting like, oh, I always loved Chuck and all this shit. It's like, shut up. At least don't say anything. You know what I mean? For some reason, the internet age, there was tons of hype around this band. They would eventually become, within the underground, the most popular death metal band, many would say. Albums that people panned in the past all of a sudden loved, and they had a bunch of new fans that came out of nowhere that eventually convinced all the people that were involved in the past lineups and Eric Greif to work together to make a tour to not only support efforts that were important to Chuck, but also to celebrate Chuck's life and the awesome music Death put out by doing the Death to All tour, which featured like an all-star lineup of all the band members that worked with Chuck. no matter what Chuck and his band members fought about or any of that dumb stuff or the musical changes that rubbed some people the wrong way at the time, none of that matters, because at the end of the day, not only was Death one of the best metal bands, one of the best death metal bands, maybe even my favorite. I'd have to think about that, but they're definitely up there. But the really interesting thing is that they were able to have tons of support after the band was already dead and gone. A huge fan base where most of it is people that got into them afterwards. And the most interesting thing of all is that Chuck, even though he was annoyed with death metal, he became the man that people associate death metal with. His band became the cutting edge, as well as the band everyone associates with death metal and the band that everyone starts with. But his legacy and what he wanted to see of, you know, people kind of getting into his progressive metal tendencies and stuff, he kind of actually crossed the bridge of not only having people only like death metal or only not like death metal and stay away from that. He was able to bridge people into both sides. I've met people that only like traditional metal. I've showed them Death, especially some of the later stuff, and they thought, wow, this is really good. And to me, that's truly Chuck's legacy.
Subscribe to the Downfall Network.
No!